now for the introduction of the topic lecture, assistant debate coach at the University of Michigan, Kevin Hirn.
Is this good? Can you all hear me? Okay. So this is not the easiest topic ever. There's a lot to cover, and a lot of it's pretty technical. There are like basically 5 elements in this resolution: security co-op, NATO, biotech, cyber, and AI, that would really be enough to cover a year's worth of debates if a resolution featured them. And so hopefully that's a little bit of a, lead into trying to learn as much as you can. So just this is basically the plan for the lecture. It's going to start. It's fine. Yeah, it's good. Okay. It's going to basically just be in 3 parts. And the 2 things that I'm going to focus the most on are NATO and security cooperation. Because like I said, there is more than enough there for an entire year's worth of debates. Security cooperation is especially interesting because unlike a lot of the rest of the resolution, it's actually kind of straightforward without a ton of controversy about what it means. It's, as we'll see, it's broad, but it's well defined by the federal government. And there are a lot of related kind of processes that are going to come up in debates a lot. So let's get right into it. The term security cooperation means any program, activity, or interaction of the DoD with the security establishment of a foreign country to achieve one of these 3 purposes: building partner capacity, as it's usually called, providing access to a foreign country, or building relationships that promote specific security interests. Those are goals as opposed to programs, but this term is used both in DoD doctrine. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's in charge of just the overall doctrine of the military, put out a lot of releases that describe it, and they basically have used this or a very similar definition for a while, and it's also defined by Congress when they fund the DoD. It's been used basically in the last 5 NDAs, which is the annual funding appropriation bill that Congress passes in order to keep the military funded. So this is the text, but it's kind of unhelpful for debates in a lot of ways, mainly because it doesn't tell us very much about what it doesn't include. So here are pretty much, I think, some of the core areas that we'll see. And for a lot of this lecture, I'll focus as much as I can on the parts of security cooperation that deal with like NATO or emerging tech, or the parts of NATO that can kind of fit with security cooperation. But it's kind of useful to know the whole picture of what these terms mean in a vacuum as well, because it's going to be hard to make heads or tails of what you're reading about them if you don't really know. Okay, so security cooperation is basically just the DoD interacting with another country's military. That's the core theme behind almost every activity that you'll call security cooperation. Not every time that there's a military interaction is necessarily security cooperation, but for the most part, if it's security cooperation is always interacting with another country's military. We do it a lot. We do it with 224 countries and international organizations. And there's 3 formal reasons that we do it. And these aren't just like secrets or like in think tank pieces describing why we should do it. These are like formally in US code and DoD doctrine. First, it just enables us to help other countries become better and stronger militaries. And so if we're allied with a country, and we believe that there is some shared goal we have, maybe we're in alliance together, or maybe they're just a temporary partner of convenience. If there's some reason we want their military to be doing well, we have by far the largest military in the world, and so it helps us to encourage them. And for the most part, in terms of like the overall funding, most of the security cooperation that falls under this goal in the last 20 years has gone to counterterrorism, although a lot of it is now shifting towards Ukraine in order to counter the threat that Russia poses. But for the last like 20 years, counterterror in the Middle East or Africa was what most of this objective kind of entailed. The second is to entangle U.S. forces with allies to promote interoperability. So this is kind of similar to improving the other country's military, but the difference is their other country's military might already be quite good. But that doesn't mean that if we were to engage in a battle together with them, we'd be able to do very much. People speak different languages. They use different systems of measurement, something as basic as the metric system versus the standard system in the US. They have different gauges of weapons. They have really all different ranks, different hierarchies. Really every element of being in the military between two countries, can be quite different. And so I have like a long, not super long, but there's like a guy from NATO talking here about why the Ukrainian defense of Russia was successful, and in part it was because NATO established air superiority around Ukraine, which limited their airspace. And the reason they did that, I'll just read it here. The rapid ability of NATO's Allied Air Command to establish defense and deterrence has been staggering. All along the eastern flank, advanced aircraft perform around-the-clock air policing, homeland defense, enhanced vigilance. For years, security cooperation professionals have crafted strong relationships, superb interoperability, and shared capabilities. Close collaboration fosters trust and understanding that is essential to enduring and effective partnerships. These air chiefs grew up together. They regularly engage with each other, and recognizing the value of these interactions, they insist that members of the Air Forces do the same through combined exercises, training, and exchanges. And it goes on and on. He basically, is living his best Top Gun life. But that's actually very difficult to do, and it actually sounds like kind of boring, which is why you need to put a lot of money and time into it, to like literally just practice and rehearse in peacetime over and over and over again for being able to execute when a contingency emerges that you have to. And then the third is a broad category, but kind of two main things is just to become closer with our partner countries, whoever we're cooperating with. We develop a relationship almost always, because again, the US has the largest and most advanced military. When we're cooperating with another country, we are going to be providing more in terms of giving money, giving training, giving know-how and stuff like that than the other country does, and so it ingratiates us. Sometimes we do this in order to make sure that we'll have physical and geographical access to bases or trade routes. And other times we'll just try to make sure that maybe this country will then not buy arms with and develop a close relationship with Russia or China and us instead. So those are generally just what the US sees as the advantages of security cooperation and what they've kind of formally encoded them as. So I'm not going to go over every one of these, and to be honest, there's some overlap between them, but these are the major categories, at least in one budget proposal that hasn't passed yet. There are a couple of slightly different ones. And as you can see, there's kind of a division in security cooperation based off of what the goals are. So a lot of security cooperation, the bottom four things here, that is basically intended for helping developing countries we aren't formal allies with, helping countries that really have a long way to go in order to, really have much of a military at all. Those aren't as relevant for this topic because we're dealing with NATO. We're kind of bound by the resolution to only be able to cooperate with them. And so while that matters, a lot of those will not come up as much, with the exception potentially, based off of a topicality thing we'll talk about later, of support operations. You want to know it from the innocuous sounding phrase, but support operations is the term that describes helping or assisting in an active area of conflict. So all of the Ukrainian or Ukraine-related defense aid is qualified as a support operation. When we gave a bunch of arms to Somalia while they were in open conflict, that's under support cooperation. So, or support operations, so that's kind of what that is. Two of the things at the very top that I'm just going to just define briefly. Exercises and military-to-military engagements sound kind of the same, and they do overlap, but they're a little different. And get used to it, because based off of like the overall layout of the topic, this type of mechanism is going to be ubiquitous. Like you're going to see this in debate after debate after debate. AFSPIT, if you're actually trying to figure out what they do, these are kind of the core areas. So an exercise is just when you have a training exercise with another military. You oftentimes will establish like an elaborate scenario, and you'll try to react or get on the same page and see how you do in a world where a Russian bomber breaches airspace, and how quickly can the Navy work together and develop the set of maneuvers they want to in order to control both the air and sea spaces, stuff like that. Military engagement can include that, but it's often used to describe something even more intense, which is exchanges and educational activities. And so and this happens a lot in the military, people will actually have either leaders or entire units of enlisted soldiers go to the other country and like live in their military base and try to work with them at that level. So it develops a much closer working relationship that enables you to understand pretty deeply what's going on. International armaments cooperation generally entails arms sales a lot of the time, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So those are the general areas that security cooperation kind of funds. So I made an assertion earlier that security cooperation is really well defined. So I want to make you know how I got there. Because after this, I'm actually going to go through a whole bunch of different T violations and like ways to spin or understand the word security cooperation that might make you think, hey, this term's not a term of art at all. It could actually mean anything. But just based off of how the federal government has used the term, it's so kind of set in stone that you're working against a consensus if you're going to be like security cooperation is something wildly different. Okay, so in 1971, when Carter was president, he established the Defense Security Assistance Agency, well, technically his Secretary of Defense did, to supervise military assistance and international military education and training, as well as foreign military sales, which is one of the two major programs for arms sales, which is how basically all the weapons that we sell to other militaries comes through this program. So at this point, all these activities are called security assistance. Towards the end of Clinton's presidency in 1997, and if you ever start, which when you're doing research, you absolutely will, looking through military documents, you will notice that there is so much jargon and repetitive overlap in almost really anything you'll read. Clinton tried to streamline a lot of that because that was a problem in 1997 as well. And so 5 different areas of cooperating with other countries' militaries got put together into one term and eventually into one agency. So humanitarian assistance, which in this case is just military humanitarian assistance. There's a hurricane, somewhere off of the coast of West Africa. The Navy comes in and tries to rescue people. There's an earthquake in Haiti. The military or the Coast Guard gets involved. Those are both two examples that have occurred of military humanitarian assistance. Demining, I'm not sure why exactly this had its own agency at this point, but anytime the military gets involved in taking landmines out of the ground, landmines, typically having been used throughout the first half of the 20th century all the way up until the present to make terrain unsuitable to walk in during a conflict. And so taking those out is necessary to avoid stepping on them and blowing up. And a whole bunch more to the DSAA. So when they did this, they decided security assistance has been used kind of so much. Let's introduce a new term, security cooperation. And it wasn't very formal yet, but it entered, the various documents. And most importantly, this agency taking on all this new responsibility was redesignated the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. In 2004, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued another military doctrine update, they defined it for the first time. And basically, ever since then, Congress, which anytime you see this US code or title blank, that's going to refer to a specific item in a piece of legislation passed by Congress. All funding ultimately has to be appropriated by Congress in one of these pieces of legislation. Subsequently, Congress just took what the DoD doctrine was saying and copied and pasted that into their funding for whatever the DoD was requesting, which happens a lot. Congress usually just kind of does what they're asked to by the DoD, unless it's particularly crazy for stuff like this. So just between how long it's been used, how cross reference it is by different branches, generally this gamut of military to military interaction is what security cooperation entails. So that covers the basics, but the term security assistance, which you might have noticed here, is basically impossible to avoid. And understanding this and how to parse it out from security cooperation is going to be very important, just because over and over again, you're just going to see this here, people will try to figure out the difference between these two and exploit them when they write negative strategies. I don't want to do cooperation, I want to do assistance. So let's try to see what the basic difference is. Generally, security assistance is a little bit more economically and diplomatically focused, and legally, it has a different source of funding. It is funded by the State Department through Title 22, which we'll get to in a little bit. But everything we've talked about so far is in the Defense Department. But the State Department, which covers diplomacy, is technically in charge of security assistance. Now, one thing to keep in mind whenever you think about the Department of Defense and the Department of State, the Department of Defense is the largest employer in the world. Or actually, it's, I think, either first or second after Walmart. They're pretty close. They have like 2.5 million based off of contractors and something like that. It's a lot. The Department of State is tiny. It is well over an order of magnitude smaller, and it is perpetually cash-starved and understaffed. And so the State Department really doesn't do all that much purely on their own, just because they don't have the capacity in terms of warm bodies. Remember how many countries we do security cooperation with in terms of countries plus international organizations? Well over 200. Losing 200 people from the State Department, if you just have one on the liaison for each of those from state, that would be a huge blow to just what they're able to do. And so state is a lot more beleaguered, and I kind of think a lot of the just confusion and overlap comes from the fact that the Department of Defense just gets involved with everything everywhere. And there's just so many people in the Department of Defense on so many different teams that they cross each other's paths quite a bit. Now, the biggest area of security assistance is probably just the transfer of arms. We can loan people weapons, we can sell them. And by people, I mean both other countries and also direct commercial sales, which just go to individuals in other countries. That's a decent primer, so let's get a little bit more specific. There are two major pieces of legislation that always come out. So when we say this is the statutory source, but whenever Congress is passing one of these NDAAs, a lot of times this is actually what they're editing or referencing. So in 1976, Congress passed the Arms Export Control Act, which gives the president the authority to regulate the export and import of defense articles and services. This is when the term FMS, or Foreign Military Sales, is born. Another very big area, and one that doesn't come up a ton if you do searches for the topic terms, but I think absolutely can play a role depending on how this gets shoehorned in, is ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And that's just because ITAR is one of the major sources of export control authority. So when you try to sell stuff overseas, you always have to abide by a series of guidelines. You can't just sell anything, especially if it's something that might give a foreign military or adversary some type of advantage. And so export control guidelines determine what we can offer or sell. And in the last few years, there's been some debate over exactly how we should apply export control guidelines to, say, tech companies that are maybe manufacturing something that can be used as a cyber weapon or in a cyber operation, or even just a product that might be reverse engineered by a rival and be used to hack into us, as a small example. And certainly all types of 3D printers and other kind of materials that could fall into one of the three categories. That's sort of what that covers. That's generally in this. And they have their own manual called SAM that comes up a lot. Then the Foreign Assistance Act basically established the process for direct commercial sales, and together those are like the two major sources of authority for SA. So you can't really see the very top of this. It says major security cooperation programs, major security assistance programs. So these are definitely the areas that are called security assistance the most. Some of them, the DoD is not really involved in. So direct commercial sales, which we just talked about, counter narcotics, which is basically what it sounds like. It's not quite as much money has been put into it than it was at the height of the war on drugs, but it's basically when we're trying to stop international drug trafficking and stuff like that. Demining and keeping operations, which was actually a debate topic out about 20 years ago, about UN peacekeeping operations. All of those are administered by the Department of State. And if you're going to exclude any of them from security cooperation, these are the one. It's an uphill battle to really understand any of these programs as supporting security cooperation. There's some that will say it, and people who don't know, just like some staffer at Brookings writes a white paper, they might casually call these security cooperation. It's very, very common because already we've gotten a lot more technical than a lot of pundits might be. But in terms of how the government understands it, those are administered by state. The Department of Defense might have like consultation or like some type of assistance role, but they're not even really administered. These, however, even though they're funded under the Department of State, the Department of State's technically in charge of them, these are administered by the DoD, which means that basically other than having a State Department figurehead at the top and it coming out of what's called the State Department budget, the Department of Defense is actually doing all of the actual, legwork here. So before military sales, and a related term for military financing, IMET, which comes up a lot, we actually literally have like school for other countries' militaries, sometimes like on the ground training. IMET's a very formalized program. It's been around for a long time. A program where if we have surplus, we bought too much, from Raytheon this time around, we can sell that out through excess defense articles, and we could also give them equipment temporarily. All of those things are security assistance, but they're administered by the DoD, and most sources will call that security cooperation as well. And so using any of these is, I think, pretty clearly a topical mechanism. So just to get a little bit of graph here, we have all the exercises we were talking about, building foreign capacity. This one, which I got from the DSCA website, actually has humanitarian and demining assistance under security cooperation. I think this actually moved from Department of State control to Department of Defense control in 2017, and so some of the information is outdated. At least that's what I think. It's hard to tell exactly. It could just be that this was a funding request that got denied, but I'm pretty sure that's what occurred. And then we have all the rest of the stuff there as well. Okay. Are there any questions on that before we get into even more about cooperation and assistance? Yeah. Is that anything? Okay. Thanks. I didn't see it. That's no problem. Oh, yeah.
So just to ensure I'm following, we generally have security cooperation, the Department of Defense programs, security assistance being Department of State programs, and we have these couple of programs in between that we're generally going to consider topical because the Department of Defense is.
Okay, and they're usually called security cooperation as well. It'll be called DoD enforced or DoD administered security assistance, and it'll fall under the broader rubric of security cooperation. That's exactly right. Okay, so there's a little bit of a difference in Title 10 and Title 22 authority. It's going to be used a lot because if you were, say, a 2N who didn't really have all that much of an egg to let's have a meeting with NATO, except to make it last a little bit longer this time around, and you wanted to go for a generic counterpoint, you can go for against anything, you might be able to try to swap out security cooperation for assistance, and there are a bunch of differences between the programs. So the first is that almost all of the security cooperation programs are targeted. And so what that means is there will be a specific piece of legislation that says, okay, Department of Defense, here's money and authorization to spend this much time with this country's military for this purpose in these places. Whereas the Department of State, their authorizations will be like, you can sell weapons to individuals. It'll be very broad. In addition, it differs based on which piece of authorization you're talking about, but between 60 and 70% of all the authorizations that the DoD has to do security cooperation are actually subject to approval from the Department of State. Now, ever since really the end of the Obama administration, and probably a little bit before that, but certainly since then, and absolutely like during Trump and Biden so far, Department of State has kind of just been a rubber stamp for that. So like for a couple of years, the position to actually do these approvals wasn't even filled, and so they just automatically put it approved. It's not quite that dire anymore, but it's not that hard to get approval, mainly because state, realizes they don't have the capacity to micromanage all of these operations. But that's worth keeping in mind as well. The Department of Defense is subject to the leaky law, which basically prohibits giving any help to a country that is believed to have committed gross violations of human rights. For the most part, the foreign military sales process, especially, but really most of the things involving the State Department do take quite a long time. They're intentionally designed to be difficult to get through. And it kind of makes sense why you'd want to be careful, right? Like if you're selling guns to a military, you probably want to make sure that this military isn't likely to take them and use them against you and your forces anytime soon. And so there are all types of standards and operations and procedures, and it just takes a long time. Now, I know I said that Department of Defense authorities are usually targeted, and they really are. Like, there's a card in the T file that basically just has like a long list of basically every relevant congressional authorization for security cooperation. And you can see like how hyper-specific and narrow some of them get. But that being said, here's one of the fun things about the DoD. They can very easily transfer money between these programs. As long as they've already been authorized, a lot of times they don't even need to ask Congress, they just do it, and it's like, fine. Some people complain this might be illegal, but that ship has long since sailed. And so it's pretty easy to move funding between all these different pots. And there are so many different sources, over 100, that, at least in my opinion, if you were, say, blessed with the power of fiat and just like have the Department of Defense do whatever you want, it'd be really easy to find legal authorization for almost anything. And then the biggest roadblock for a lot of stuff on this topic is that technically a lot of Title X stuff prohibits the military from training foreign forces. So a lot of them are more in the exercise, interoperability type of thing, but not all of them. But one thing the DoD has over the Department of State is that the Department of Defense typically gets their funding for 3 or maybe even 5 years at a time, whereas the Department of State, poor guys, they just have to do it over and over again every year, despite having so much fewer people. And then also they're less flexible. Congress basically has to approve moving funds from one country or one pot to another for Department of State. So I'm going to go through 3 cards really quick that maybe make the best case we can for why Title X authority is bad. And so if we can basically force the AF into being Title X authority, there's a pretty good case for why, I know I just said, like if you're using fiat, you can always find something. There may be a case that this topic is not super well organized for it. So, basically, the first part is the Department of Defense is so often changing what their plans are and what their funding is, that adding additional specific geographic mission-based partner restrictions to a new source of authority basically just makes other countries confused and believe that this could go away at any time. No one's really sure what's going to keep on happening for it. And the more you add, the worse it gets. And no matter what you do with this topic, you're basically doing a specific geographic mission. You have to do emerging tech with NATO. That one's, but this one's not as good because it says, technically, there are some DoD stakeholders, it's like the third line here, that's kind of the money one, whom we've engaged that say that there is no reasonable authority for building cyber capacity. And by the way, cyber is, we'll get there later, but that's a little bit farther along than AI or biotech is in terms of, making the rounds in this literature publicly available like that. And so if you can't find authorization for cyber stuff, it's a pretty good bet that, that's the one you'd most likely be able to do. So we can't find any reasonable authority and could not do exchanges or training with them. Like to, but just can't. And even worse, it's really tough for the DoD to work with regional organizations rather than bilaterally with national governments. Even regional programs are implemented bilaterally with national agreements. So that's, again, not great. That being said, this one's not as threatening in truth because there are like at least 5 different authorizations for NATO under Title 10, but they're not like super broad, maybe not as much as you'd think. So I feel like it's probably the AF's best interest to be like, we don't only have to be Title 10. And in my opinion, they probably can. There's a few cards. I would say the best one is probably Hirn, maybe Anderson, that basically say like all that we do is Title 10, and they'll be speaking from the perspective of the DSCA. These are security cooperation officials. All security cooperation is under Title 10. But almost all of these are like just from, like a War on the Rocks article or conference talk in which people are speaking a little off the cuff and imprecisely. There's not a lot of formal documentation that supports that. And so if you're comparing, it's going to be tough to win that. And, that's kind of my take on all of the cards in the file that say only the Department of Defense, only Title 10. In truth, DoD administered Title 22 security assistance and just like DOS approval is involved in so much of this that it's pretty hard and kind of arbitrary to say otherwise. And so this is kind of annoying because I can't find where in the 2017 NDAA text this actually says it. But I mean, these guys work for the Naval Postgraduate School on security cooperation. So I guess, I don't know, I wish I could know what they're looking at exactly. But evidently in 2017, and you'll notice that this, which is by far like the best summary text on the Title 10 thing for security cooperation, it's from 2016. This guy says in 2017, Congress redefined, quote, nearly everything DoD does as security cooperation. So not just exercises and information sharing, but FMS, even DCS, and other programs as defined as Title 22 security assistance. And so if, that's not a super commonly held position yet, even in like modern, writing, but that's potentially true. At least one card says it. So I guess I want to go over some other ways to interpret security cooperation. But I do want to comment that these are all pretty narrow. So these will be basically like ways to exclude certain actions from plans. And maybe if they, really focus their app on something that's a little bit out there, you can kind of beat some of these on T as well. But these aren't like, every round type apps, or type of T violations. There's one good card for this in the file. There's a few more that I haven't put in there as well. There's definitely this take a lot. A lot of security cooperation is described as pre-hostilities. So what that means is, once a partner military has gotten into an active conflict, there are shots being fired, there's a declaration of war, we are no longer in the realm of security cooperation. We're doing some type of military assistance, but security cooperation is a preparatory activity that prepares you in case of that contingency. It doesn't actually mean, we're getting into war with you, like when the war is happening. There are cards that actually say this is wrong as well. There's actually a very good F one, the first one in the file under AT hostilities as well. I'm not really sure if there's a clear consensus on this. Okay, this is like so stupid and wrong, but there's like a pretty good line in this card, which is also in the T file, if you just control F what's up here. Because little T training, which protects U.S. forces by promoting safety, familiarity, and interoperability, does not constitute security cooperation, such are funded by a different source of authority. And it's even about NATO. And so that's like a pretty scary line for a T violation. It says that really any training exercise that's just meant to support familiarization and interoperability with foreign forces is not security co-op. Again, it's like pretty wrong, but those will be among the most common types of Fs, and so excluding them could be useful. And then lastly, we have this, which doesn't really have intent to exclude, but the Department of Defense has like a cybersecurity strategy that has 6 different pots for like how we do cybersecurity. And one of the pots is security cooperation, whereas others are counter-threat networks, cyberspace operations, and support operations. And so you'd be like, aha, all cyber operations that the military uses are technically distinct from security cooperation and therefore excluded as per the DoD. For what it's worth, that probably exclude a lot of AI apps as well. Not all of them, but quite a few. Now, I don't know if any of you noticed this at the very beginning, because this kind of got to me as well. Kind of give it away with the slide we got to there. Did anyone else have a problem with me being like, oh, this is absolutely what security cooperation means in all contexts? If you were going to pick on this definition, what is the one thing that maybe would give you pause from being like, yes, this obviously is all security cooperation all the time? Yeah.
It's very broad. It says any program or activity, and then it doesn't specify any specific type of foreign country.
No, we're trying to disagree with this. We're F, broad's fine for us, but we're even farther. We're doing something, wildly out of bounds. We're like, this is too narrow. We want to pick on this. We want to say that's not what security cooperation means. Yeah. Security cooperation programs of the Department of Defense. For the most part, when the DoD is defining things, they're defining it for them, as opposed to, say, other branches. And indeed, the Department of State has different definitions when they can be bothered to issue a strategic document defining things, which happens like once every 20 years. They have like different definitions for a lot of these terms. I don't actually think this is as devastating as it might appear, and the reason for that is just that the Department of Defense doctrine gets used in Congress, and then the only times that Congress will define this term in US code at all will be just whatever the Department of Defense said. And in fact, every spending bill they've passed for the military for the last 5 years has defined security cooperation exactly like that. And there's no other definition of security cooperation you can find that Congress has passed. And so if we're just trying to figure out what's predictable interpretation of this word, the fact that there's only one in US code and it's being passed over and over again every year makes it a little bit persuasive. But this is good, and the best card from this, I wish I could find one that was as good, that was a little bit newer. But this guy really had a bone to pick with the idea that the Department of Defense is the only security cooperation agent, and he's basically like, there's no common definition of security cooperation. There are a whole bunch of programs that aren't covered that basically other agencies would call security cooperation, and so we should expand it. In terms of what that actually gets you for other, AF mechanism possibilities, I would say, maybe foreign law enforcement is an area. Maybe, you don't even need to use the DoD at all, if this is true. You could just have the NSA cooperate with, the National Security Agency, the agency in charge of basically all, they're the lead law enforcement agency on cybersecurity. They pursue cyber terrorists. They use surveillance on computer networks to catch both adversaries and criminals, as well as terrorists. Maybe the NSA can cooperate with other agencies from Britain or other NATO partners as well. So that's maybe what this gets you. I don't think it'll be that successful. So in terms of how a lot of the stuff will actually get used or play out, I think a lot of this will be ultimately more about developing counter candidates and links to disads than it will about T. Now, if you have an app that's just way out of left field and they, basically have no DoD involvement, they're like, yeah, we have NIST, the agency that's in charge of setting standards for computer networks and computer standards. We have them cooperate with NATO to design the, basically the 5G security standards that we want to use from here on out. If you have something like that, I think you can beat it on key security cooperation. You pretty much got to be military-to-military cooperation involving the DoD. But outside of that, all of this stuff is really important because whether or not security cooperation includes various elements of security assistance will unfold accordingly. And remember, a lot of these programs are kind of similar. And so if you can be like, okay, we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to fund it from a different source that's more flexible, and NATO likes it a little bit more, that's a win, because you have, two similar strategies. How would you pick? Well, the one that allies like a little bit more happens a little faster. Doing it twice and replicating it just makes it more confusing and wasteful. And beyond that, I do think that the Defense Security Cooperation Agency is very difficult to avoid using. Now, the director in 2019 said, quote, "We are mandated by Congress to execute all security cooperation." Gotta love that in debate when you find a card that says all and definitively like that, because it enables you to just be like, nope, there's no exceptions. This is the guy himself. Hear from the horse's mouth. We guarantee a link to some department of, or some DSCA, trade-off or internal politics DA, if nothing else. Yeah.
So you mentioned the federal card again. That talked about having essentially the conflict, but also talked about, for example, Department of Defense Security Cooperation area of active conflict. Is that just a conflict in the literature?
Yeah, basically. For what it's worth, I think Fennell is not correct about that. I think Fennell is describing the congressionally authorized goal. So, we're not using security cooperation to help in areas of active hostilities. But if we decide that we're actually going to do it anyways, then that supersedes the ostensible goal, if that makes sense. But the goal is written in the statute there. Okay, so two quick things before we move on from my beloved security cooperation. I couldn't really fit these elsewhere. If you should maybe just when we have some time, go through the Department of Defense, just like Wikipedia page on their structure, and see just like the sheer volume of different agencies you have. Some of them will come up a lot of times. But this is the basic structure of the hierarchy for the Department of Defense. So we have the Secretary of Defense appointed by the President at the top of it. You have the military, which in terms of its attachment to the Cabinet Department, the Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, Department of the Air Force. There's also a Marine Corps and Coast Guard, which I didn't put on there. But the big undersecretaries, and there are more undersecretaries than this, but the ones that are involved in like these foreign cooperation or procurement practices, you have research and engineering and defense and acquisition, and they have huge staffs that do a lot. Technically, the DSCA is located in the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which is a pretty powerful position. It's like one of the highest ones there because these are the people that technically set the entire doctrine and policy for what the military wants to do and why we do it. And so the DSCA, they're kind of like disliked by some in the DoD because they're, really, really desperate to have as much power as possible. Like they fill out and try to take over, authorizations that other sub-agencies aren't using, and they, just try to get their hands on everything. They always have something to say. And those, basically describes some of the attitudes I've seen towards it. So every time you hear JCS, which is kind of what we're referencing when we, talk about these doctrines that are published, it's like a JCS, green book. That's the Joint Chiefs of Staff who are basically, they've surmounted the hierarchy to be at the very top of the civilian and military apparatus, and they're the ones who basically run the show and are on the ground in Washington with the president making the highest executive level decisions. In terms of this, so you'll see this term sometimes, SCO. That always usually refers to a foreign army, whoever is the assistance of whatever security cooperation we're providing. I spent a while kind of embarrassing looking for this, and I was like, what the hell is the security cooperation organization? Because it's like always capitalized. It's usually kind of just describing the foreign partner. And the DSCA, when working with those foreign partners, obviously they're overseen by the JCS, because kind of everybody is, but they also have to deal with geographic combatant commanders. So these are the Department of State's regional bureaus, and they basically have analogs in the Department of Defense that kind of geographically divide all of these programs. And both for state and defense, when we authorize building partner capacity or a series of exercises, even if it's for a very broad area, it's very rarely going to be broader than a regional bureau. And so these are all kind of isolated, I don't want to call them echo chambers, but there's definitely a stark division between a lot of the different regional bureaus. They all do sort of their own thing. And obviously they try to coordinate and interact, but they're not amazing at that. So obviously the US and Canada, which are both NATO countries, are in NORTHCOM, but NATO is, every other NATO country is in EUCOM, although they do have a border with both CENTCOM and PACOM. And so CENTCOM covers the Middle East stuff, and PACOM is East Asia. So that's just kind of worth keeping in mind. All right. Let's take a 5-10 minute break. It's been, I think, like about an hour even sitting here. So come back, we'll say in 10 minutes, and we'll do the rest of this lecture. right. All right, let's get back to it. Hey, let's start the lecture again. Yo. We're going to start the lecture again. Hey, West, come on. All right. I know. Security cooperation was not my cup of tea. Maybe it was yours. Can't imagine that. This next one is, in my opinion, a lot more interesting and sort of exciting. So I've been dreading getting security cooperation over with so we can get to the good stuff. All right, so NATO is a seminal military alliance that the US is in. There are currently 30 member states. All of them are in Europe. You have both a list here organized by when they acceded, as well as the US and Canada. There's likely going to be, throughout the course of this topic, 2 additional NATO allies joining, Finland and Sweden. And so, all the way through the 2010s, there's still been countries being added, most recently North Macedonia and Montenegro. So what is NATO? And basically, I included everything here. I thought about trying to summarize it, but to understand what it is, it's probably easiest just to read the treaty itself. So 4 years after the end of World War II, as it was pretty clear that the Soviet Union and the United States are not likely to get along, we found a military alliance with European countries, and these are kind of the terms of it in the Washington Treaty or the North Atlantic Treaty. Okay, so bless you. First, we just agree not to start wars if we can avoid it. The parties undertake to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means in such a manner that peace, security, justice are not endangered. The second, and this one will come back in a little bit, is that it's not just a military alliance between countries that have common national security interests. It's a military alliance between countries that have common political and economic interests. They say, we will contribute towards the further development of peaceful and friendly international relations by strengthening their free institutions. They will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies. Now, it's pretty vague language, and so generally this is interpreted as being pro-democracy and capitalist economic policies. I guess if you're committed authoritarian or communist, you could make a case that a free institution, a truly free one, would not be, capitalist or democratic. But we don't actually say what those are. But generally, that's how it's understood. Number 3, basically, we just say we're going to continuously do military planning and development in order to prevent conflict. Number 4 is that the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any one of them, their territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. This has happened quite a number of times over the years. Turkey requested consultation over and over again, but they finally stopped. And most recently, this happened, I think, 5 or 6 countries formally requested it. And, Biden and and a lot of the top brass in the DoD went to Europe and had a formal meeting after Russia invaded Ukraine. All right, so those are all things that will come up here and there. But when we're talking about NATO, what really is important is Article 5. This is the big one. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and they consequently agree that each of them will exercise the right of individual or collective self-defense as defined in Article 51 of the UN. They will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, never get to use that word too much, forthwith, individually or in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary. What they want to just draw your attention to, when the US or any other ally takes action, it is whatever action they deem necessary. And so, it could be a phone call, or it could be a nuclear weapon. It's whatever they determine is necessary. Ideally, you're cooperating and you have joint plans, and so you know what to expect, and everything will kind of turn out the way you want to. In a lot of ways, what security cooperation is about is kind of setting the stage for an effective response to a contingency like this. But that's generally the process. But it's not just as simple as I say, I've been attacked, now you do what you want to. The treaty also establishes an overarching decision-making structure, the NAC, which we'll get to in a little bit, which basically is a committee that involves every NATO member, and they really all have to agree that an Article 5 situation has been invoked. There's only been one Article 5 declaration in the entire history of NATO. It was a response to 9/11. But ironically, the US kind of rejected this. It was done very rapidly. And the US actually no, we prefer to lead operations outside of NATO. We're going to set up a coalition of the willing that we get to control. And a lot of that was also to integrate non-NATO allies like Australia into the coalition. But that's the only time it's happened. And then one other thing to draw your attention, this is despite the fact that 9/11, is that an armed attack has to happen in Europe or America. Those are pretty clear geographic areas. And then Article 6 spells it out even more clearly that, it has to be maybe in some of these territories of European countries, and they actually scratched that Algerian one after Algeria became an independent country. That's just the original free text. And they also clarified that this means any aircraft or vessel that's in those areas. Two just active controversies here. Where exactly is cyberspace? Is it whatever, critical infrastructure you have? If that gets hit in your country, is that an attack in your country? Okay. What if you have infrastructure that's necessary to the functioning of your country, but it happens elsewhere? Or what if maybe your internet connection is used to route an attack from one country to the other? Is that then an attack on you as well? And also, where is space? If there's an attack on a satellite, satellites constantly rotate around the Earth and are in a different position, minute to minute, but they also have a fixed orbit that does the same thing every day. And so where are those and how does those apply? Are kind of open controversies. There's some other agreements, you can't contradict, with UN requirements, can't enter into agreements to contradict this one. But that's what the North Atlantic Treaty spells out. So you'll see references to this a lot. So is NATO a political or a military alliance? It's both. They actually have literally both a political and a military leader. Because the US is far and away the largest military, the military leader is always a US official. But because NATO's never really declared Article 5 much, the peacetime political leader is the one who's actually in charge day to day. It's kind of like, Roman consuls. I don't know why if that would help anybody. It's basically they swap positions if, a crisis occurs and war breaks out in terms of being the head leader. But obviously both have a lot of authority. So these are just the mission statements on their website describing what they try to do. You know, they say that they're both political and that they try to promote democratic values. You don't really have to type all this out. Just kind of keep this in mind when we get to a little of the topicality stuff. So the North Atlantic Council is the head authority. You know, that's what it looks like in real life. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to get a consensus reached by unanimous verdict for a group of maybe 5 or 6 people on something as trivial as where to eat and had any trouble. I certainly have. As you can imagine, it might not be the easiest thing to reach consensus, which is, in a way, part of the justification for all of the constant interactions and cooperation that are occurring day to day at every level. That's because we're always building to understand the perspectives and integrate our forces and interests with one another so that we can actually facilitate, to the extent possible, similar interests. The NAC always has political control over the military, and every decision is by consensus, no voting. If you say no, I refuse, the decision can't be made, no voting. Yep.
You mentioned earlier that players to like drastically change the trajectory.
I would say they absolutely provide an opportunity to write arguments. I'm going to suggest one when I get there in a little bit. But, you know, does it drastically shake NATO? Like, no, they've been actually pretty close partners for a long time. And even though they liked their neutrality, it's like not really surprising that they decided to come in the wake of this. But I don't think it, like, you know, is bad for the topic by any means, although it may not be something that comes up most rounds. You know. Yep. I mean, in truth, your guess is as good as mine, but we'll get there when we talk about kind of problems with NATO. If you want a preview of it, it's basically the most successful strategy would be to communicate on areas of common interest that maybe gradually draw closer and minimize areas of divergence because they're not going to fix those. Yep. Not if it's not in Europe or America, technically. So, topicality for NATO. I like this card a lot, not even really for being a T card. I did put it as a violation together just because it says that our bread and butter is cooperation on like military things. And as I'll get to in a second, I think AFS might be a little bit more creative than you might first imagine with how they're going to organize NATO. So I paired this with a card that's like substantially in the main BAMT violation. But the part I like about this is just, this is like the guy who was in charge of NATO policy in the Department of Defense for a while. I'm just going to read some of this. His writing here is funny. NATO is a culture of intensive, banal cooperation. The really boring part of NATO is where the agonizing particulars of interoperability and doctrine are worked out. It is operational realization of the inane political aspiration to cram soldiers from 14 different nations into a single brigade. It ensures that you can trust the colleague next to you because you've worked with her in such a setting 100 times before. It ritualizes behaviors and makes them 1,000 minor decisions that builds the block of strategic dexterity that you can sometimes demonstrate. Like vegetables to a child, NATO is never what you want, but usually what you need. Where else do you force common purpose and consensus on scores of dissimilar nations by want of incessant badgering, which is pretty much the job of American officials at NATO? If you are a hard power type, I remind you of the fact that 52 militaries operating in solidarity to impose their martial will makes you understand Putin's hostility towards the alliance. Okay, and so I like that because in terms of like my take overall, really what the American officials at NATO do, and this is technically security cooperation, these are people who are housed in the Department of Defense, they badger NATO into doing what they want them to, and because the US has such overwhelming military superiority and is like, doing a lot more than their fair share, it typically eventually gets their way, at least in terms of the nuts and bolts of like military doctrine issues. There are some things that we might have just a total impasse on, and we do what most people do when they have problems, which is just ignore it, even if they fester for a while. And so, ambitious asks will try to solve those. But for the most part, the US can just through, I don't know if you want to call it tactful, if all they're doing is just incessantly badgering, but they can, through persistence, usually get their doctrine detonated. Not always, but usually. So, in terms of T, I do think that Egg might try to defy NATO in limiting ways, and they're going to want to do this for two reasons. The first is that, just again, just like, look at this, like, well, what's the F? We're going to do cyber interoperability and minor doctrinal improvements. I'm sure there's a great dissent against that. Again, like this is going to be like a lot of what the strategic apps on the topic try to organize themselves around. But also, the topic does not say NATO member states, it says with NATO, but NATO has 40 partner states. And a lot of what NATO does is outside of Article 5, right? Remember Article 3? In order to more effectively advance the objectives of the treaty, we're going to continuously and effectively do self-help and mutual aid. Okay, and so as part of NATO, one of the things that cooperating with NATO is going to do is improve your military, make it more interoperable, make it better. But do you need all of NATO for that? For cooperation, you probably need at least a partner, but not only is there the other 29 members of NATO, NATO actually has various degrees of formal partnerships with 40 other countries. And if that wasn't enough, you can always add some more that we don't currently have. In fact, a lot of the best stuff you'll see about, say, artificial intelligence, and really only stuff you'll see about biotech and NATO, is oftentimes going to bring up China as the primary adversary, and they'll talk about building partnerships with allies in the Asia Pacific accordingly. And if you're trying to avoid this whole NATO, some nag on about NATO, you're like, yeah, but we only do some NATO outreach to build a relationship with New Zealand that integrates this one cyber operation. So I imagine teams might want to try to limit that out. And here's the best case they can make. These cards are in the starter pack. They could basically deny that NATO's a political organization at all, and they could say that it's essentially a military organization. Francis Fukuyama, a guy who's probably most famous for, after the Cold War, writing an essay called The End of History. It was like, well, history's over, liberal democracy won, GG. Not exactly the greatest prediction of all time. But he has said NATO is a military alliance built around its Article 5 guarantee. NATO is fundamentally a security treaty. You see this elsewhere as well. And even NATO says on its website that the core of NATO is the Article 5 guarantee. So you can read this. It'll show up in 1MCs. But, I mean, it's terrible. The app cards, not only are they normative, like for the most part, he's describing what should be the case. He doesn't like all these side missions that NATO does. He thinks that they should focus on their bread and butter security alliance. And so he's describing the world aspirationally as it should be rather than as it is. And also, they don't have much of an intent to exclude. There's nothing that says NATO doesn't do political things on the side in order to prepare. And so, in terms of just defining NATO, I think this Weaver card that says that there are 4 basic activities: decisions and consultations, partnerships, the means to respond to threats, operations and missions that we're constantly doing. If you're going to do special operations, intelligence, cyber, you basically have to do it through there. I would talk about Article 5, but basically NATO has, in their latest strategic doctrine, which I'll get to in a little bit, They have 3 core missions, so these terms are useful to keep in mind. Collective security is basically the Article 5 part. It's the military alliance part. It's the part that says, if somebody attacks you, I attack them. That's collective security. And collective defense is the stuff that, interoperability, consultations, partnerships, blah, blah, blah. There's one card in the file that says, quote, informal cooperation is actually a huge part of what NATO security cooperation entails. And this is like informal developments of like norms that you make an attempt to explicitly formalize outside of the formal procedure to streamline things. All of those are technically parts of cooperation. And so, if you wanted to be like, well, maybe I can't get everybody to agree to the cyber policy, but we can make like some ad hoc coalition of NATO states that will agree to it and don't have to get full consensus for it, we can fit that under informal cooperation. I feel like there's not an amazing limits case for that, although it does exclude implicit norms, I guess, but it's not, it's pretty predictable, at least in terms of the quality of the card and its sources. It's predictable as any of the others. So, NATO and what they're doing. By the way, I did forget one, it's up here, but in addition to collecting defense and collective security, they say their other big kind of alliance-wide goal, their core task is crisis management, which, is in a way from 2010, a little charming because they kind of imagine they've outgrown armed conflict. And, now it's time to do humanitarian missions. We've got to stop pirates off the coast of Somalia and stuff like that. But unfortunately, I don't know if crisis management is quite at the highest priority anymore. So every 10, 15 years or so, the Alliance has just one big guiding document put out that explains what the organization's about, what its intentions are, and tries to formalize as many of their procedures and opinions as possible. As chance would have it, this summer is when they're meeting to formalize the next one. The last one hasn't been, altered since 2010. Annoyingly, it's constantly abbreviated as SC, which is the same as security cooperation, but whatever. So there are probably 5 huge issues I would identify with NATO. I'm going to go over each of them right now. You'll notice that only one of these issues is something that you could clearly do with a topical plan. It is one of the big issues. It's a big one. But there are some other ones on their minds as well, that unless you have some ingenious way to like shoehorn a procedural change to NATO that can then solve everything else into your app, it might be tough to deal with, but gotta keep in mind for how you construct your arguments constantly. One of the biggest ones is every nation in NATO really working in the interest of NATO? Again, we have like this Article 2 requirement to promote freedom. At least 2 states have, by most accounts, your freedom houses and the like, crossed the Rubicon into being somewhat authoritarian, and that is Turkey and Hungary. Turkey especially is a pretty weird, player in a lot of conflicts. They have conflicts with many different nations, which puts them in all sorts of strange positions in terms of like who they're allying with one moment and against the next. For the most part, people are suspicious of Turkey being close to Russia, although Turkey and Russia have actually come far closer to conflict with each other than Russia and any other NATO ally when Turkey was supporting the opposite faction in the Syrian conflict all throughout the 2010s. Turkey basically has, if anyone's going to veto Sweden and Finland being acceded, it's them. Hungary, definitely democracy thing's an issue, but even more than that, the nation in NATO that's closest with Russia is probably Hungary. Part of this is maybe their political sensibilities, like they're both authoritarians who hate the press and love putting them in prison, but they're also economically tied at the hip. It'd be very, very tough for Turkey especially to impose some of the harshest sanctions that nations want to, some trade responses to the Ukrainian invasion. So NATO needs consensus for every decision, and I list every treaty facet, but there wasn't a provision I skipped in the North Atlantic Treaty about exit. There's no way, in the treaty at least, maybe there's some weird international law mechanism, but there's no clear way to expel somebody from NATO. It's like a gang, once you're in, you're in. The second big area is China. And for the most part, this is just because the biggest great power dyad in the world is by obviously the US and China. We have kind of a rising power, and there's naturally probably be some tension there. Moreover, they have a relatively distinct political and economic system, and so that tension is sort of multiplied. That being said, China is the most ambitious nation in the world with the most money, and they're closer to Europe than you might think. In fact, a lot of their big outreach program across Central Asia all the way to Europe in the 2010s, often called One Belt, One Road, or the old name for the New Silk Road, was basically meant to do a whole bunch of infrastructure development with European countries that kind of tied them to China. And so there are some nations in NATO that are definitely more wary of upsetting China than others. The European Union is another big one. So I wish I had time to go into all of these a little bit more in depth, but again, this is the thing about a topic that just has so much in it. So the European Union is a political and economic organization that has most of the countries in Europe in it, not every one of them, and Britain famously left in 2016. In many ways, they've been wildly successful. 30 years ago, you'd have to swap currency, every 100 miles if you traveled across Europe. They've gotten on a common currency, and being in the EU comes with a decent amount of stipulations that shapes, a lot of national policy. And so the EU is a huge overarching organization that has a lot of influence on almost every area of policy activity for its members. But it is not a security organization, though there are some who would like it to be. Even NATO allies, probably most notoriously about 2 or 3 years ago, the French President Emmanuel Macron, have suggested that perhaps European autonomous self-defense, in which European countries outside of the US, outside of NATO, not having to listen to, their wannabe parent across the ocean, should maybe strike out on their own. There's sort of a rivalry between the two. I don't know about tension. There's also a lot of cooperation as well. And the EU is the organization that NATO cooperates with formally the most by far. So a lot of overlap with that, and exactly how we should treat the EU and whether or not there should be kind of internal self-defense and stuff like that. I think this one will fade. And honestly, the Ukraine war sidelined this a little bit, but for the last 10 years, the big thing NATO allies were doing together, and also the biggest recipient of security cooperation, was their alliance in Afghanistan, or their military operations in Afghanistan. And so when the US basically pulled out in a way that caused global humiliation and violated what a lot of NATO allies saw as the proper military procedure, it ruffled a lot of feathers and also ruined the active source of cooperation and interoperability that was building for a long time. I think they might get over it, but pretty fast news cycle these days, but it was not good. And some of the thorniest issues in NATO, however, are absolutely about emerging tech. And And that's nice for us because we can actually solve those pretty clearly. Yeah.
From the is
Well, so a lot of people would agree, and NATO actually says they have a lot of text available on their website, NATO.int, in a lot of places, that the core element of NATO is this Article 5 security guarantee. Above all else, more than anything, what brings these countries together, why they're bothering to cooperate in the first place, what makes them have a common interest, is this very serious decision to enter into a permanent alliance from which there is no exit that will aid them in a war, even if it's at the expense of your own national interest. It's a big deal. And so that's really what NATO's about. It's just that, if you're going to talk about what NATO does, they entered into that alliance because they also have political goals to promote democracy, and they also, in pursuit of being prepared if that contingency ever emerges, they do a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't require you to really affect that side of thing. What you could do with this is be like, okay, if NATO is fundamentally a security alliance, if that's what it really means, you can't cooperate with partners. They're not really in NATO, they do some stuff together, but they're not in NATO, like that. We should understand them as such. And you could also say only plans that directly affect something fundamental about the security treaty itself, which is key because it's actually exactly where I am and what I'm about to talk about, is a topical way to interact with NATO. Now, the cards don't make a predictable case for why a reasonable person should read NATO that way, in my opinion, but they make a case. And if you really thought limits over predictability all day, you could win a debate on that. Does that help?
Yeah, I was more so wondering why would we
No, the reason he's against it is he's very pro-liberal democracy. And you just go on the articles from the hyperlinks are in the T-file. They're very, very short, almost like blog post style. But basically, he thinks that NATO is erring in doing all of these non-core operations because it inevitably causes a divergence of opinion and differing interests, whereas if we kept it simple, we'd actually tie ourselves together and be able to get stuff done more effectively. He thinks we're straying too far to make it effective. So yeah, he likes liberal democracy, but he actually thinks that, I also think that he wants us to basically kick Turkey out 100% and almost boycott doing NATO stuff until Turkey's gone. Yeah. They're an opportunity to write arguments on the topic, which when you're negative is never something to pass up. But they're going to affect the topic and be important, but a lot of the core definition stuff we've done so far is not going to change. Yep.
Functions as security cooperation.
So as collective security, I think you can say, no, we actually have, it's hard to totally exclude interoperability, but I think he's we're doing too much together. You have to, if you're going to say you're cooperating with NATO, to do it in a meaningful way, you have to alter the alliance of some sort. You have to do something with the military alliance part of that. Only Article 5 is part of NATO. And so, no, that wouldn't be topical. But I mean, even just, trying to explain that is not the easiest thing ever. It's not, so I'm not very bullish on this interpretation. So obviously, if you're going to be a good military alliance, you're probably going to want to prep a little bit for when the war happens. So the big emerging tech issue that is related to the military alignments part is basically what does an armed attack entail? So remember, if we say an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe occurs, it will be an attack against all. If Russia, say, hacks into a major company that actually is in charge of the closest operating system to the nuclear weapon arsenal in the US, would that be an active attack? Because if they went in and like tried to break in to a missile silo hosting a nuclear weapon, we consider that an armed attack. Because in 2020, Russia actually did just that. And they hacked this cyber software company called SolarWinds that many, many parts of the DoD and the Department of Energy, which is in charge of nuclear weapons, ran their servers off of. And so, that's probably right compared to what some people think Russia's done in terms of information warfare and stuff like that. And so, whether or not a cyber attack constitutes an armed attack is an open question. Technically, if we haven't decided, there are some documents that would say formally NATO's kind of pigeonhole themselves into saying yes, and they don't really want to say no because then it just invites those attacks. But if you say yes, then you're basically saying, oh yeah, time to go to war with Russia because they've been doing this stuff all the time. The armed attack issue isn't quite as clear for like biotech, but for cyber and AI, it's probably going to be in a relatively similar capacity, and AI will probably, just be cyber attacks that are, kind of cooperation that happens, assuming kind of like a logistics F. AI weapons, like if you have like a swarm of robot drones attacking you, clearly that's not attack, pretty obviously. And that's a big issue. So before I move on to the areas of cooperation, and I'm going to say just a little bit on each of them, I do want to have like just a little bit of a summary of what this topic is so far. So we haven't mentioned this, and it's not even going to be super obvious from the stuff I'm going to say about the other areas, but this is like the most bi-directional topic I've seen in a while. And I don't remember one that are quite as much of that. What I mean by that is usually topics have you commit to doing something you can get some offense against. You're either going to, I guess water wasn't the greatest example because maybe you could try to get privatization as an app or something. But generally speaking, you're going to have to protect water resources by the US. You're going to get some ground against that. There is the security cooperation and NATO stuff, but in terms of what the mechanisms of any app is going to do, you could just have NATO decrease the use of offensive cyber operations. Offensive cyber operation is exactly what it sounds like. The US very famously used one against Iran in 2010, where we used a Stuxnet virus, which even though their nuclear program was not connected to the internet, somebody got a flash drive in it and was able to basically take it down. And so, that's the most obvious use. The others are, there's a whole bunch of different types of cyber attacks capable. Or you could just say, no, we're not going to do that. That's a bad idea. You could say we're going to respond to cyber attacks as if they're armed attacks, or you could say, no, we're not. You could say we're going to ban legal autonomous weapons, or you could say, no, we're not. Totally bidirectional. As a result, like a lot of the times we have foreign policy topics in debate, I've seen a lot of them, you kind of have like a core DA that's like, either the topic is about appeasement and like cooperating with the country, and I could be like, no, don't do that, they're going to take advantage of you, or it's about deterring a country and being stronger, and the other nation's like, no, it's going to piss them off. You kind of have to have both ready to go at all times, and even then, apps are going to try to play Goldilocks. So, that being said, all of these areas that are interesting and necessary for NATO to function well, it's really tough for apps to solve all of those, because you can't really shift NATO policy very easily beyond making minor doctrinal changes. I was going to cover this earlier, but just in terms of summarizing some of the topic stuff, one thing I was thinking about, can AFs just ignore all this Title 10 and 22 stuff and be like, well, we make a new funding stream. It's going to be in whatever title we feel like, and it's going to have all the authorization they need and be clear and combined authority. That is how fiat works. We are imagining an ideal plan and then doing it. In my opinion, probably, that makes sense to me. But maybe not if the neg, maybe we'll decide the neg's in such bad shape, we need to throw them a little subsidy. Maybe they could say increases pre-existing, so you can only increase pre-existing sources of statutory authorization. And if I was neg, that's how I organized the T violation. I'd say increases pre-existing, so you can only increase pre-existing sources, can't enter new ones. That's how I'd put it together, and maybe that's viable. But, yep.
Would it still count as security cooperation if you're not using either the Department of Defense or the Department of State, Title 10, Title 22?
Well, so I think you've probably just lost the term altogether if you don't involve the military. And if the military is in the DoD, it's really hard to avoid using the DoD. You're basically like, we're going to just do, we're going to have Department of State or some other non-military agency go up to foreign militaries and be like, here's what to do, here's what's what. Not a lot of advocates for it, and it's honestly the DoD would barely even let that happen. And it's tough to do. Like maybe there's some strategic advantage. I'm sure people will try, and it's possible, but I don't think it's going to be super common, and it doesn't seem to be a super viable reading. There are going to be a lot of debates about security cooperation for these reasons. Although we do security cooperation with over 200 countries and organizations, as opposed to one. But like I said, I do think people are going to go crazy with this partner thing. At least that's one way I was trying to proliferate Fs where I would go. When you're writing an F, I think you want to have a series of defenses. The most obvious one is you have to have a reason why your security cooperation as opposed to, say, diplomacy or security assistance with the Department of State. But beyond that, you also have to think about NATO. And because both NATO and security cooperation are fundamentally about military-to-military engagement, to me, it's going to be tough to have AFs that are like really preoccupied with civilian infrastructure and stuff like that. Like if you're trying to talk about, a cell phone, like the 5G standards we use for public networks, if you're trying to talk about, people, the laws we should have for, agricultural biotechnology, even if those are the first things you think about with biotech or AI or cyber, I think it's going to be hard to write apps that work outside of the military. And, if you're just talking about cooperating and trying to spread standards for some new tech thing, you just have the US cooperate with the EU and say NATO is bad. Because people will do that if you're neg, you got to definitely prep NATO bad. And remember, if a counterpoint solves the whole F, you just need a risk of a link, and you're in business. Now, if they have those defenses, I do think that the F's in a really good place because there's not a lot of unique offense. So just really quick, here are some ideas, some of which are the shells of user in the T file, others of which not at all, for how the neg might try to develop generic offense. So one idea I have, not sure if anybody's writing this, I'm not going to do it first wave, maybe I will later on during the camp if no one does, is a Turkey DA. So here's how I'd write it, and it takes advantage of the Finland and Sweden thing. I would be like, Turkey's going to let Finland and Sweden into NATO now to deter Russia, because the longer it takes, the more opportunity Russia sees to strike before triggering Article 5. Turkey is like really upset with NATO for a lot of reasons. They think they've been terribly wronged by the organization time and time again. And so they can only take so much posture change at once. Any hint that they don't like the plan, and they will then hold up something that we're cajoling them into doing. That's one. I like that one because you just do Turkey dislikes the plan links, which, it's not, the direction thing might be a little easier there. Second is the strategic concept DA. Depending on how long it takes to formalize this, people said it was going to be done in June. As far as I can tell, they barely started. It's hard to find a lot of news writing about this, but it's going to be a while. Definitely going to be good for camp, and maybe afterward as well. if the US were to unilaterally start trying to impose new changes on NATO outside of the context of these of these meetings, it would probably distract from the concept and probably diminish overall US influence in the process. And so impacts to why that's good, and this is kind of like as close as you're going to get to a politics DA that's generic. If there's one agency I felt confident you could win is always involved in security cooperation, it's the DSCA. It's in the name. And as a result, if you have trouble with, trade-off DAs to the entire DoD, given how many sources of funding there are and stuff like that, there's only so many people in the DSCA, and they do a lot. As I said, they're kind of, they love to take it over, anything tangential related to their agenda, they love kind of asserting themselves in. And so I think that's probably the way I'd most want to have a DA to be the benefit to these generic class kind of plans. And the last one is, and there's links to this in the cyber and AI parts, randomly, a lot of the definitions of cybersecurity and maybe not AI as much as lawful autonomous weapons actively say it's basically about harming property. There's like a notion of property rights that you, when pursuing cybersecurity, when pursuing artificial intelligence, necessarily commit yourself to. The AI one's a little bit more tangential, actually. It's better with the autonomous weapons. But for a K, that seems like a pretty nice thing to have. The 92 NC perm block, certainly against cyber. So, this topic is not going to look a lot like past foreign topics, or a lot like past topics at all, in my opinion. So, are there any questions before I move on to areas? Man, I wish I had more time. Yep.
Do you think the bidirectionality of the topic is going to help the limits diss out on T or hurt it by making?
I think help overall. I think help. Like I said, apps that stray really far. Like, as somebody, I in high school I went to a small school, just generally be our personality. My impulse is always to run away from where everybody's spending time and arguing and stuff, and just do something else. But of all the topics, this is the one where it feels like the core Fs at the very heart of literature that seem boring and basic are at least, maybe there's some crazy stuff hidden out there somewhere, but these are clearly very strategic and pretty good Fs, and so beating those core Fs is going to be tough. But the more you stray from that, unless you really know what you're doing and have some tricks up your sleeve, the easier it is for the bag to just destroy you with generics. Okay, so there are going to be lectures on all these things. I'm not going to try to do a ton here. I'm going to mainly try to give some background information that links AI to the rest of the topics, and also explains some T work. So AI is generally a pretty broad term. There's some debate that attempts to narrow it and stuff like that. And there's also some debate over whether what I'm about to say is accurate. But a very common definition is that artificial intelligence is tech that can mimic human brain patterns. It can learn and make decisions so that, basically that's what AI is able to do. Now, in my opinion, AI is very, very broad and it encompasses everything from the most sort of cartoonish, strong versions where robots are taking control, all the way to what's just called narrow AI, which is basically when you can program a computer to figure out how to accomplish a task better than you can by thinking about it. For narrow AI, the easiest way to think about it is just to think about chess computers and stuff like that. So, for a while, chess computers weren't good enough to beat human chess players, but with more processing power, they just had so many computers could experiment with a million different results, and even though we don't know exactly how, they figured out ways to play chess that destroy any human. And the moves that no human would think to make logically, we don't really know why they work. That's kind of the weird and almost scary thing about AI, is that whatever AI usually uncovers, it's uncovering a way to do something that doesn't make sense to us, and we don't really know why it works. Maybe we can first engineer the reason after the fact, but we can't figure it out before, and maybe not even after. So narrowly, that's all AI really is. But then, as we, or at least that the then we kind of add some other layers on top of it, especially if we start trying to have them make military decisions about who to target, what vehicles to drive, and stuff like that. But I actually don't think a lot of military AI stuff is going to be as, theatrical as that. A lot of it right now is actually just going to be about algorithms for data collection and logistics. There are some interesting AI programs we have. An agency that's involved in some of this stuff I didn't talk about a lot so far, called DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects. They have these drone missiles that basically do everything, all of the targeting, they're launching. It's done by their understanding of how to best defeat an adversary. I would say there's like a difficult debate over exactly where autonomous weapon starts. That doesn't hold for a second. Last thing real quick before I get to that. NATO actually, in October 2021, put out a new document on what they felt about AI. But it didn't really say very much. It was just like, we gotta cooperate and do better. They refused to talk about autonomous weapons, mainly because the US and the UK seems to not want to forestall their use, but some of the other countries want to ban them. And by autonomous weapons, I just mean what it sounds like, a weapon that's capable of making a decision to press the trigger or kill without a human at the, control. So that being said, the DoD actually has published a process for figuring out whether or not a weapon is autonomous or semi-autonomous. And this is important, mainly because for a second I was trying to think okay, how can I make this topic huge? And I was trying to see if you could maybe fit all types of precision, guiding technology. And there already are kind of some precision guided weapons out there that seem to be autonomous. There's this decades-old unmanned drone in Israel called Harpy that up to 9 hours it'll just spend in a region waiting to detect an electromagnetic emission consistent with that of a known enemy, and there's no human in the loop, and it'll kill the enemy if it senses it. And that's been going on for a long time. So these already exist to an extent. A lot of missile defense can be described as that there's a line in the one-NC evidence on this question in the file that basically says, if an F-35 starts to have an AI guided, missile trajectory, is it now an AI weapon? So the Department of Defense has this long process for determining whether or not a weapon is semi-autonomous or actually autonomous. So if it's an exempted category, which is cyberspace, mines, obviously it's guided by the operator, or it doesn't kill anybody, then not an autonomous weapon. For those, if it has to be not human supervised, it has to be anti-material, which means it's attacking a military installation as opposed to an individual person, like a drone strike. So individual targeted killings don't count. And there's a lot of controversy about that from especially the first half of the 2010s. All of those, and then they got to consider it an autonomous weapon. And the reason that's important is because they just established a review process for you're restricted from using autonomous weapons. I kind of like this because even if it seems like a lot, it's going to be a relatively arbitrary line, where a weapon becomes autonomous. There's all types of different, lines you could draw there. It's more of a spectrum. But the DoD literally drew that line, which is about as predictable as anyone's going to get. And it limits out basically all next-gen weapons, or even just arm sales of F-35s from being topical. So I think that's an important one to have if anyone tries this, which they definitely will. So that's the most important key contribution to AI. Beyond that, I'm going biotech now. The term biotech is really broad. There's one card I found by a Canadian engineer who believes it's actually an obsolete term, and that synthetic biotech is really distinct, and that indeed you can generally try to prod organisms into doing what you want them to through biotech, but you can't actually edit them, which is key to like all the next generation technology that is very useful. And so almost nothing that you want to solve is viable. That being said, it's just one card and by one guy, and the source material does not agree with him, and so I don't know if that's going to be a huge winner. Broadly defined, biotech is just technological innovation based off of biology. We're manipulating living things into reproducing or otherwise acting in a way that we want them to. It has been going on for a long time in the agricultural and the medical contexts. Kind of makes sense. If we can edit a crop in order to make it less susceptible to parasites, make it so that it doesn't need as much of a fertilizer, make it so that it'll grow in different temperatures, we can more cheaply and easily feed people. And in fact, by some estimates, the greatest humanitarians in the history of the planet are biotech scientists who were able to introduce strains of wheat into Mexico and India during famines that otherwise couldn't grow. So shout out to GMOs. But in a medical context, we also see this in the early 2000s. There was a huge ethical debate over stem cell research, which, from we use fetal tissue in order to try to develop cells that can grow into organs that we can then use to replace, as transplants. But it's also used in a lot more everyday and banal contexts, and it's come a very long way. So that's what biotech basically is. There are other industries where it's used, manufacturing a little bit, but like really ag and medicine is where its foundation is. Those are the two. You'll notice that neither of those is necessarily a military context. And of the three areas, the DoD and NATO have so much less about this than they do about cyber AI, at least an order of magnitude. Probably not 2 orders of magnitude, probably about 100 times less, but between 10 and 100 times less. And as a result, there's not a lot here, but obviously there's not a lot of leg stuff as well. And there's certainly something happening. China has put a lot of money into biotechnological advances for the military. And a lot of these can be just like very basic, almost medical treatments for how we can regenerate cells quicker so we can heal from injury. It's kind of basic medicine stuff. But honestly, all the military contexts here, it basically is about genetic enhancements to soldiers at its core. That is what most of the biotech stuff is going to be about. If you're talking about military to military co-op, that the military is good at and belongs there. So obviously, my mind jumps straight to super soldiers. And there is stuff about that, like actually from like crazy people in the DoD from a while ago too. I saw this woman who was the longtime president of the Army War College, just start casually talking about spider silk armor and like the prototypes they have with that. As you might know, spider silk, maybe not, is the strongest natural material in the world. It's way stronger, pound for pound or gram for gram maybe, than stainless steel. And so if you were able to produce that at scale somehow, you'd have the best armor ever. And it actually would be so lightweight, it would almost like attach to you like a second skin. And a lot of it is just going to be about like wound care, people don't have to sleep as much, like stuff like that. It definitely gets into some weird territory. When you're writing this stuff, you just got to keep in mind DoD, not public sector, is key. Because unlike cyber and AI, where the military is very actively involved and there's a lot of restrictions on what you can do, most biotech development in the US is done by private companies. It's like DoD is lagging behind them significantly by so much really that it's not clear what they immediately have to contribute. And so I don't really think like ag biotech or vaccines or stuff like that. It's, maybe there's something there, but it's like a military-to-military co-op thing. It just doesn't seem like the right vehicle. And it seems that, in fact, militarizing these things might cause some degree of backlash from the people who are trying to, impose our biotechnological enhancements on, and might be better served by civilian cooperation agencies. Well, that's just my impression here. So I think most of the stuff that's going to get read is going to be about some type of genetic enhancement of soldiers, which, interesting, fun stuff. All right, cybersecurity. So the term is really poorly defined. The first thing, there's like 3 or 4 huge articles, like if you go to Google Scholar, you'll find like 3 articles that have at least 100 citations from, they're all between 2010 and 2015, that are like, how to define cybersecurity. And their consensus is, no one has any idea. It's a vague, confusing term. So one of the articles called Fighting Cybersecurity Law makes what's a quasi-useful debate in TERP. And it uses a formulation called CIA that's very common, which is cybersecurity promotes the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems networks. And so you could almost make an argument that you have to, in order to have a cybersecurity, and not just cyber confidentiality or cyber integrity, in order to do cybersecurity, you have to have some type of cooperation or formula that attacks at all 3 fronts. So confidentiality here means that when you're operating in cyberspace, you want to make sure that anything you don't want to get out doesn't get out. So if a data breach in a website's database, you're buying something that you're embarrassed about, their database gets leaked and the world gets to see whatever you're getting, that's an example of a confidentiality breach. Integrity refers to the guarantee that the message sent is the one received. So if we deface a website, it's for integrity. Availability refers to the guarantee that information is available to the consumer in a timely and uninterrupted manner. So if you DDoS, distributed denial of service, if you just hack a website such that you send so many requests to it that it can't operate, you've made it unavailable. For the most part, most of what we think about is like cybersecurity in a military or security sense is usually going to be like attacks on important civilian infrastructure, anything for military installations, civilian plants, hospitals, stuff like that. A lot of this is going to be about availability, but you could be like confidentiality and integrity need to be a part of the strategy. Now, in truth, this is pretty clearly aimed at like a domestic legal and economic context, not a military context. So that doesn't help, but it's something, and it's not super limited otherwise. I have a few T angles. I spent a lot of time trying to come up with this stuff, and I found some things that are like funny, and I bet they will each win at least 1 round, but I mean, that's kind of sad because these are all such trash. I guess exclude cybercrime. There's some stuff that says it excludes cybercrime, and one other thing that's important with this is a lot of cybersecurity is actually controlled by law enforcement and not the military, okay? And so law enforcement just refers to domestic agencies who don't represent the U.S. Overseas or not kind of housed within the military. The National Security Agency is a classic example of this, and the FBI, the CIA, all these intelligence agencies are technically domestic police agencies, and some people are like, what they do is cyber crime. That being said, they all like counter-terrorist stuff that's pretty bread and butter cybersecurity. So I don't think this makes a lot of sense, other than maybe you can use it to exclude if like it asks like literally about fraud or data like manipulation, maybe election hacking, maybe you can include stuff like that. Okay, property rights I already talked about before, same thing. Okay, this one's just kind of funny. It's wrong. It's like wrong at multiple levels. But there's one card that basically defines cybersecurity as, you see what this card says, public and private information systems networks. It just replaces that with the internet. And to be fair, the internet's by far the biggest of all of these. But as far as we know, the exact information is actually classified. But as far as we know, nuclear weapons in the US are air-gapped. Actually, up until 2016, they could only be even serviced with a floppy disk. They're now digitized, but they're still very far from the internet. The internet does not, you're not logging on to DoD.gov and sending the launch code for a nuclear weapon. And so if cybersecurity is just the internet, you can do nothing about nuclear weapons that's cybersecurity. And then I'm kind of surprised this doesn't exist, but there's a huge debate over whether or not we should pursue offensive cyber operations. To me, cybersecurity, I would just imagine some, some Friends for Peace type of organization would, it's anti-war, would be like, this is not cybersecurity. This is imperiling cybersecurity. It's going about the offense. Like the term actually refers to only defensive maneuvers. But weirdly, nothing even remotely credible. I put core articles, like nothing, but that's able to get there. I thought it exists, but I wasn't able to find it. So in terms of the core design, there are some big debates in the cyber literature that a lot of apps will maybe take a stance on, and you should definitely have these prepared kind of both ways. Like I said before, if an app takes a stance on whether or not we should respond to cyber attacks and armed attacks at what level, every part of that is hugely debated in military circles. Some people are like, strategic ambiguity is the way to go. We should not tell them, they keep them on their toes, keep them guessing. Some people are like, no, we should set the threshold low, so that way it's actually credible and we look legit. There's a lot of what are called hybrid attacks that dominate the literature. Some of hybrid war is stuff that maybe isn't quite cybersecurity, but the vast majority of it, to me, kind of seems encompassed within cybersecurity. Hybrid war just refers to non-kinetic ways of damaging an enemy, but you typically try to, if you ever try to annoy somebody just by, making their life as miserable as possible without them wanting to punch you, like you're a classic little sibling type, that's basically how Russia has, organized its entire military strategy for the last 2 decades. They attempt to do what damage they could, but won't come back to hurt them economically, and won't cause literal wars to be declared against them. But they step right up to the line, and maybe a little bit over it. And so, for the most part, figuring out how we respond to that is a huge part of what cyber does. And although NATO has a lot on cybersecurity, famously in 2007, this was my cyber lecture, so I'm not going to go super into this, but Estonia, one of the Baltic states, was attacked in a major cyber attack by Russia, which provoked a lot of debate over whether or not we should respond or exactly when we should respond. That's huge, and then whether or not to use offensive cyber operations is big as well. Now, I talked a lot about FMS earlier. For the most part, we're not doing FMS in any of the topic areas. There's no weapons to sell, at least yet. The only thing that there's even a discussion about is cyber operations. For example, there's one known as a zero-day vulnerability. And if we're not thinking about a cyber weapon that we keep in an arsenal, this is pretty much the textbook example. A zero-day vulnerability is a vulnerability in a commonly used piece of software that has been known by the software engineer for exactly 0 days, which is an annoying way of saying they don't know about it. And so, as a result, you're sitting on a vulnerability, typically a way to access information, break into systems, stuff like that, that people using the system don't know about and that the manufacturer is not willing to patch. And so 0-day vulnerability is what you need to hack into, say, another country's servers. And it seems like the classic way of thinking about this, although there's some people who are like, it wasn't like this at all, is you have the DoD and the NSA just trying to accumulate mountains of these, and maybe we could sell them to a rival. There's actually a couple of recent articles about this by a guy named Max Smeets. He thinks the idea is bad, but a lot of the reason he thinks it's bad is because he doesn't think the US would be willing to share. So maybe that'd be a good bonding experience. We become cyber warriors together and figure out how to take over the Russian military. I will say it's kind of hard to do arms control about rules of the world in cyberspace. mainly because the people we care about are adversaries who aren't in NATO, who like wouldn't listen to it anyways. But that's generally the scope of where I think the core cyber stuff is. There's, I'm sure, a lot on the fringes. Cybersecurity is the most developed field of any of these. There's the most literature about it. It's the closest to actually kind of having, a lot to do with both NATO and the security cooperation stuff. And 10 years ago, it would have really sucked because most US cybersecurity was the NSA. But in 2010, the DoD established Cyber Command, which has, as the DoD always does, kind of taken over everything, and it's like now really the lead practitioner of cyber, offensive cyber and like overall cyber strategy. And so, it's not a terrible time for having like a military cooperation cyber topic at all. But that basically does it. I do have a minute left, so I can take a question. Maybe if there's somebody who thinks they have a good one. Yeah. There are two basic ones. DoD, bad for some reason, often trade-off plus like security assistance, and NATO, bad plus US co-op with EU or other. All right, that's 12:30. We're going to call it. If you ask anything else, but yeah.